Hello, my name is Exile, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about Acha of Deira. And Acha is the mother of kings. Welcome back. So in today's episode we're going to be talking about Acha of Deira, and Acha was the mother of two really important Northumbrian kings, Oswald and Oswy, two really important early medieval kings of Northumbria, this really powerful kingdom that eventually controlled much of the centre of the British Isles. So obviously you've got southern England down in the south, which would be parts of Wessex, the Midlands, which was controlled by Mercia, Northumbria in northern England and southern Scotland, and then obviously the Scots and the Picts up in what is modern day Scotland. And so Northumbria was bang in the middle and was involved in continental Europe, in Ireland, and obviously was later on affected by the Scandinavian, first of all Viking raids, and then the Great Heathen Host or the Danish invasion, which occurred in the 9th century. So this is all the sort of history that we're dealing with. When we're looking at this as well, I wanted to speak about in today's episode about Acha, because she is a really amazing person and yet we know so little about her. And it's because we know so little about her, I wanted to do a little bit of detective work, digging into some of the history and seeing if we can get more of a picture of this amazing woman. Because sadly, so much of the stuff we know about Acha is actually based, first of all, from the works of Bede's ecclesiastical history. And Bede was a monk who was working in Northumbria, and he wanted to write how the Northumbrians had come to become Christians and how God had intervened with the English people and then had basically caused for the Christian message to be spread throughout Northumbria. So that's the sort of thing we're dealing with right here, is that this is a sort of a Christian story where we can then pick out little bits of it and go, all right, how does that line up with the archaeology? How does that line up with the history we know? And what is the actual picture we've got going on here? And there's some amazing stuff within Bede's ecclesiastical history. And I definitely suggest if you're passionate about this period, read it, but also just take it with a pinch of salt as well, because Bede is telling us a story and he's inspired by the Bible, but it's still a great source for this period. Now moving on, what do we actually know about Acha? Now what we know about Acha is about her father, her brother, her husband and her children, especially her sons. Now immediately some of you are probably screaming at the screen and going, Alex, how dare you? You know, all of those guys around, all of those guys, specifically guys, are around her, but what do we actually know about Acha? And unfortunately, we don't know really that much. We don't know when she was born. We don't know when she died. We know her name. We know her father, as I said, her brother, her husband and her sons. But other than that, there isn't that much we know about her. And so what I wanted to do today was see if we could get more of that picture, more of that story, and do a wee bit of detective work. So I hope you'll join me on this journey. And if you like the sound of that, why don't you subscribe now? Because I think you'll really enjoy the channel and what I try and do here. So I'm going to jump in and I'm going to look at her close family, her father and her brothers. So her father was Ella of Deira. Now Deira was a kingdom which is now North and East Yorkshire. And when it was a kingdom of North and East Yorkshire, it was probably a post-Roman kingdom. And Ella is the first recorded king of Deira. And when he's the first recorded king of Deira, this is sort of like a post-Roman kingdom that is now in the period that many people call the Anglo-Saxon period of the early Middle Ages. When it's this post-Roman kingdom, we know that Ella is the king of it from 560 to 588. And you're probably going, well, I've heard the name Ella before. And it's probably, if you're a fan of the series Vikings, because of the fact that there is a later king called Ella, basically in the 9th century. And he is the one who apparently kills the semi-mythological Ragnar Lothbrok by throwing him in a pit of snakes. If you haven't watched the series Vikings yet, massive spoiler, and I'm not sorry. But I would suggest you go onto the channel, and I've got a good series about the sons of Ragnar, and I think you'll really enjoy that. But jumping back into the early medieval period, we've got Ella of Deira. And when we've got Ella of Deira, he is the first king we have recorded of this kingdom, and he has 3 kids, Aethelfrith and Edwin and Acha. Now when he has those children, when you've got those kids, Aethelfrith goes on to be the father of Herrick, and Herrick is the father of Hild, who is a really important Northumbrian saint in her own right. And I'll do another episode about her in the near future, so watch out for that one there. Alongside this as well, you've got Edwin. Now Edwin is Acha's brother, her other brother, so you've got Aethelfrith and you've got Edwin. Edwin becomes the king of Northumbria as well. And so you've got these three characters around here. Now also we've got a lot of literature from this period, and when we've got the literature we have an early medieval Welsh poem called the Gogodin, which is basically where the King of Edinburgh puts up a massive party for nearly a year. And when he has this massive party, he invites a lot of young warriors to come to him, he gets them all pissed on alcohol, he gives them weapons, and he says, right, we're going to go down and we're going to kick the living daylights out of the Anglo-Saxons. And so they go down to a place which we think today is Catterick in North Yorkshire, and they have a massive fight against the Bernicians, who are the northern half of the Kingdom of Northumbria, and the Derians, who is the southern part of the Kingdom of Northumbria, and they get the living daylights kicked out of them, massively defeated, and it's a great tragedy for the early medieval Britons or the early medieval Welsh. So when they get the living daylights kicked out of them, it is thought that that happens around about 600 AD. And one of the kings leading some of the Anglo-Saxons would have been a guy called Aethelfrith. Now Aethelfrith is the king of Bernicia, and we know that he had a first wife called Deira, and Deira gives her name to Bamborough, which is the fortress you can see just behind me here. And she has a son with him, and that's Aethelfrith. So we have Aethelfrith, and he then later on chooses to go up and live with the Picts in Scotland and becomes the father of a future Pictish king. So that's Aethelfrith's first wife. And when we have that, he is a very fierce king, and he then also defeats a king of Scots. Now, if you've been on the channel for a while, I apologise, you've heard this a few times, but the Scots were people who lived in Northern Ireland, in Ulster. And they came across and they occupied the west coast of Scotland, and on the sort of the Western Isles, the west coast of Scotland, and it was a kingdom called Deira. And so when you have Deira, the king of Scots, around about 603, was a guy called Aidan MacGraban. And Aidan MacGraban, he grabs together all of his forces, his allies, and he comes down and he attacks against Northumbria. Maybe he thinks, all right, the Gogodin, the people around the Edinburgh area, they weren't successful. I'm going to have a go, and I'm going to try and become sort of an overking of Northern Britain. And they fight at a place called Dagstan. And when they fight at this place called Dagstan, Aidan MacGraban is defeated and he flees away. And from that point onwards, the Bernicians, they seem to have some form of overkingship over the kingdom of Deira. And so when they have this overkingship, Aethelfrith now seems to be in a really strong position. And he comes down in 604 and becomes the king of Deira. So what he does is he unites Bernicia and Deira together and they form one kingdom. Now when they reform that one kingdom, Acha's brother, Edwin, he just flees. He just gets out of there and he goes and lives in the Midlands in the kingdom of Mercia and marries a Mercian princess. Alongside this as well, her other brother, Aethelfrith, he goes and lives in a kingdom called Elmet in West Yorkshire. So he's gone off there and he decides to live in that area. So you've got the two brothers have left, and Acha is on her own, and she gets married to Aethelfrith. Now when she gets married to Aethelfrith, it's probably from 604 that they get married. And this is where we can start putting some dates together. So with both of her brothers fleeing away, Acha is on her own, and she then marries Aethelfrith. Now this is where we can start doing some speculation. Is this a willing wedding, or is it a bit more the fact that Aethelfrith has come in and gone, I am now the king of Deira? And when he comes in and says, I'm the king of Deira, I'm going to marry your princess, and that makes me a legitimate king. We've got to wonder what's going on here. Many historians seem to see it as this warlord has come in, kicked down the door, gone, I'm marrying the princess, and it's kind of like Super Mario Bros, but with swords, spears, and early medieval warfare. Think of it that way, if you want. And that's how you often read it in the books. But I wonder if it's slightly different, because we actually have a date of birth for Edwin. We know that Edwin is born in 586. Now if he's born in 586, he's 18 years old. So he is a young princeling, and he is now, this sort of young man, 18 years old. So maybe the powerful men and women of Deira are now going, well, we've got an experienced king here, a guy who's, had 7 years on the throne. He's experienced, he's powerful, he's actually quite a force within our region. He's already defeated the king of the Gogodin, who are around Edinburgh. He's already defeated the Daladian king, Aidan Magraben. This guy is going to be quite an important character. And so the other two guys, who are Aethelfrith and Edwin, they do what lots of young princes do back then, and they just leave the kingdom and they choose exile. Because, it's probably better to choose exile than death. And they go away, and then Aethelfrith comes in and he marries Acha. So that could be another picture. It could be a lot more understood, because a lot of these princes actually choose exile and live somewhere else until it's time for them to become king. Aethelfrith himself seems to have spent some time in exile as well, because his father was actually a king of Northumbria, and when his father died, his uncle became king. So maybe Aethelfrith had spent time in Deira, and he had grown up in Deira for a bit. And if he spent time in Deira, maybe he was known to the locals, and so it's a lot more of a peaceable solution. Maybe he already knew Akha a little bit, and so it's a much more peaceable, much more friendly circumstances of their wedding, rather than, a shotgun wedding with a guy with a lot of weapons around the place going, yeah, I'm marrying your princess. But you take it as you want to. So in 604, she gives birth to Oswald, who is her first son with Aethelfrith. Now, if we say that she was born in the same year her father came to power, Ella of Northumbria, then that would mean she was 44 years old when Oswald was born. Now, I know today that that's medically possible, but we live in a modern society with modern healthcare, and that sort of thing can support that. I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest in the early medieval world that's less likely. And a 44-year-old woman in the early medieval world, I'm going to say probably isn't going to give birth to 8 children. Forgive me if you think that's maybe unrealistic, but I think I've got enough behind me to suggest that, that's not going to happen, because she went on to have 8 children with Aethelfrith. So there's something for you there to consider. So while that's going on, we've then got the fact that we could take another date. So let's say she's born in the same year as her father dies in 588. That means she's 16 years old when she gives birth to Oswald and 16 years old when she marries Aethelfrith. So that's something to consider as well. Now that's entirely possible within the early medieval world, and it's entirely possible biologically. So there's 2 things there that line up and give us a youngest possible date for Akha when she is married to both Aethelfrith and also gives birth to Oswald. So there's our youngest date there. But we also have a date of birth for Edwin. And when we have a date of birth for Edwin, Edwin is born in 586, which makes him 18 years old. Now when he's 18 years old, I'm going to suggest that Akha is actually his older sister. Because I think that how it may have been is Aethelfrith is first, then Akha, then Edwin. So suddenly when he's 18 years old, we can now put Akha in her early 20s. And I think this is more likely. A princess is probably going to be married in her early 20s, she's got a bit more life experience, and also there's some political movements going on in the kingdom. She's got a younger brother, he's not suitable to king, she's got an older brother, he probably decides it's not politically worthwhile, or he doesn't feel he has the support to take over the kingdom, which means she is in a position to marry Aethelfrith, and then from there she goes on to help form this early Northumbrian kingdom. And as I said, in 604 Oswald's born. They then go on to have a total of 8 children, of which the named ones we know are Oswald, Oswy, Oswadu, Oslak, Osath, Otha, and Ebba. And those are her children. And we know that Oswy, the second son who then goes on to be a king of Northumbria, is born in 612. And so when he's born in 612, that's 8 years after Oswald's born. So again, we're getting more of a sort of timeline so we understand what's going on here. And again, if it's 8 years later, I think if she was the earlier date and we say she's 44 years old when she gives birth to Oswald, well, she would be 52. And I don't think that that is possible, so I'm just going to say right there, I'm going to go with a young Akha rather than an old Akha in this particular storyline. But again, it's really interesting to really dive in and do this sort of detective work to go, what's possible, what's this person like, what's the world, what's the situation, what's the geopolitics, and really put this together to get a bit more of an image of this early medieval kingdom of Northumbria and this character Akha. Now, what happens next is in 616 is the next date we have. So Oswy is 4 years old, Oswald is 12 years old, they're a young family. And what happens is Aethelfrith dies in battle against her brother Edwin and also Ragweld of East Anglia. So when he dies in battle, suddenly she's in this position where she's got 8 kids, the youngest of which that we know of, the date for, is 4 years old, and the eldest of which is 12, and her brother's going to come home. And I'm sure her brother isn't going to be too pleased about some young princes in his court who basically he's going to look at and go, well, you know, you're a risk just like I was a risk to Aethelfrith, so I'm going to kill you. So because of that, she takes her kids and she takes them up to Deira. Now I find this really interesting, and I think there's 3 different theories that we could draw from this. The first theory is that Aethelfrith, when he drove out Aidan MacRaben, basically put some nobles who are probably more aligned with him in power than Aidan MacRaben. And when he puts these nobles in line, suddenly Akha turns up at their court, and Akha is this woman who they owe their position to her husband. And even though her husband's dead, they feel as if they owe a debt. And so because of that, they then pay that forwards and help young Oswald and Oswy grow up in their kingdom. They're trained as young warlords in the kingdom of Deira. They learn Irish, and they also grow up around Iona. So they learn about Celtic Christianity, and these young princes are then helped later on to go back and retake Northumbria as their kingdom. So there's a really interesting one right there that gives us a bit more of a sort of a geopolitical view on this. The second theory is that she may have been related to the kingdom of Deira, and there's the possibility with that because we don't know who her mother was. We know that Ella obviously had children, but her mother could have easily been a princess from that kingdom because these princesses and these princes are very mobile. I've already said how Beba, the first wife of Aethelfrith, was actually produced a son, and that son Aethelfrith actually chose to do his exile with the Picts. And from him you get a Pictish king, Talaran. So there's something really interesting going on there where just because you're a prince of Northumbria or Bernicia or Deira doesn't mean you end up there. You could end up in a totally different kingdom, and the princesses are, just like in medieval Europe, are going to be married to different kingdoms, and they're going to become mothers in an entirely new line of kings, maybe in a different kingdom. So they've got some really interesting stuff going on there. So she could actually be half Irish, and her mother could have been a Daliatin. And if that's the case, she's returning to her maternal family. And if she's returning to her maternal family, they're going to welcome her back because these princes are part of their family. So there's another possibility right there. Though, because Bede doesn't mention it, and he's probably a little bit clued up as to the family trees, we can say that that's slightly less likely. The next and final possibility is that she could be a Romano-Briton in part. And the reason why I say that is because the Romano-British elite, more and more in archaeology now, are realizing that the Anglo-Saxons didn't come in and wipe them out, kill the Romano-British, and instead there seems to be a lot more mixing. There seems to be the Anglo-Saxons coming in, mixing with the established elite and becoming new styles, fashions, aristocracies, all of that's going on. And it's a really interesting period, this 5th and 6th century in Britain. So when we've got that going on, I think that she could actually be descended from the previous Romano-British elite. And so the Daliadans, they might see that as something that's quite prestigious. So a woman who has a family line going back to this famous Roman period. She's a part of that Roman romanticism that they look to, and obviously their Christianity is also drawn from that sort of Roman source as well. So that has an added benefit to her. So they take in her and her sons, and when they take in her and her sons, that then leads to them being fostered and looked after within this Irish kingdom. I'd love to know what you think in the comment section below as to which of the theories you think is most likely, and alongside this as well, what you find most interesting. Because when I'm looking at Akha, I'm starting to sort of, in my theories and my thinking, trying to get a picture of this woman, because we don't know her hopes and dreams. We don't know if she had a loving relationship with Aethelfrith and they had 8 kids together because they really loved each other, or if it was much more a political marriage and it had to be done and so they had 8 kids. We don't know if she had like political things and she looked at her little brother Edwin and she went, ugh, little brother Edwin, I don't really like him. Let's get rid of him. Let's get rid of him and I'll happily marry Aethelfrith. Or if one day Aethelfrith just kicked down the door of her family home when your brother's left, your other brother's gone, I'm marrying you now. And if it was more of a forced marriage. We don't know if she was involved in the politics of that suddenly meant that Deira looked very favorably on her family. We don't know if it was because of her family line or if it was her bloodline that they looked upon favorably, or if it was the fact that her husband had put people in power and they wanted to pay it back and they were going, yeah, we remember your husband, we were loyal to him, and so because of that, we're going to look after his kids. That's the amazing thing about this period. There are so many possibilities, and when we look at the documents we have to search through them, combine them with other sources and things like that to get a picture of what's going on in the early medieval world, and then compare it to the archaeology and history. And so that's why Acha, this mother of kings, this amazing woman from the early medieval period, is so captivating for me, because, you know, we don't have something named after her like Bamborough Castle is named after Deira. We just have her name in Bede's ecclesiastical history, and we know that she was this woman who existed, but nothing else. So I really hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if you have, please do like and subscribe, share the video with your friends, and if you have enjoyed the video and you'd like to support me further, I do have a Ko-fi account and a Patreon account down in the description below, but there's no pressure from me as always, and only if you want to. In the meantime, stay safe and well, and I hope you join me for another video in the near future. Until then though, thank you very much.